Sonic Frontiers is a game I was definitely very optimistic about. When I saw that initial IGN reveal, I know everybody was like really upset at it and stuff, but I was really excited about what I saw in that game because I was really looking forward to seeing how Sonic controlled an open world and what kind of impact that a game with Sonic speed would have on open world game design. And the reality is it's probably not that different, honestly, in a lot of ways. But the fact that Sonic is so fast, I think solves a lot of my problems with open world games. Because personally, I think a lot of my problems with open world games is that the fact that like, there's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of downtime where you don't get a lot of interesting content. And there's a lot of downtime where you don't get a lot of interesting rewards either. It feels like a world often filled with filler a lot of times. And that's absolutely true with Sonic Frontiers as well. But the fact that you move so fast in this game, I think kind of glosses over that a little bit. So I was really excited to check this game out, and thankfully, like, I think it did the majority of what I wanted this game to do. Because, like, Sonic is just really fun to move around that world with. It's maybe not as flexible as I was hoping it was. I think I was kind of expecting Sonic to be able to kind of like traverse over mountains a lot easier and things like that. But honestly, I think it probably makes a lot more sense to have a lot more restrictions in place and like how Sonic can move. So early on, especially, like, it's really hard for Sonic to kind of get out of the areas of the game that they really designate you to kind of traverse. But as you kind of go on and you get more speed boosts and things like that, and there's like this way you can like kind of charge up and get an additional speed boost on top of that, it kind of opens up the world a little bit more where you're able to like kind of run up the sides of mountains a little bit more. It's definitely not easy, but it can help you get into spaces where you might have needed to use a different path and things like that. This game is like full of like floating obstacles. If you watch any footage of this game, you're just going to see a bunch of trash that's like floating in the air. And all that trash is basically like, you know, the springs, the loop-de-loops, the 2D side-scrolling sections. They're basically tiny floating Sonic levels in the world kind of thing. And they feel really good to get into and go through. And some of them are definitely like the faster way to get around if possible. So I usually, especially early on when I'm first exploring an area, I usually will go through a lot of those little like floating obstacle course and things like that. I honestly prefer it because it's just really exhilarating, you know, the usual Sonic loop-de-loops and you know, going on rails and things like that. It's really exhilarating to do those little things. The only real problem I have is that it's often really hard to tell where you're going to be going once you get out of it. So it's kind of a linear section of course that you're on. So even though you're in an open world, you're kind of, not all the time, but a lot of times you're kind of locked in to this little like loop-de-loop section or something like that. And so it creates these situations where you're kind of locked into going whatever direction the game wants you to go, unless you kind of really go out of your way to like forcefully get yourself out of it. But a lot of times when you get into one of those obstacle courses, you don't know where you're going to be spat out, and if you don't know the levels very well, you're going to end up just kind of looping around a bunch, I feel like. But thankfully, I think early on, it's not really a huge deal. And then if you really need to get to a particular spot, you can just simply just like run around the world itself. So it's like you just basically just go around all the obstacles and things like that. But you do want to use the obstacles because they will give you resources. So when you are going around the world and going through these obstacle courses, you're collecting like a bunch of these, like, I don't know if you call them like relationship items or something like that, but each area of the game has like a character from the Sonic universe that you need to collect items for, and then you turn those items in for cutscenes and things like that. And it, kind of the whole game in a lot of ways is kind of based around this flow of like resource collecting and then resource spending. There is currency for unlocking the cutscenes themselves, like I mentioned, with the characters, and those cutscenes, you know, advance the story and bring you to the next part of like, you know, what you need to do. And there's like certain things that are locked behind those cutscenes as well. There are these things called cyberspace zones, which are basically like, in some ways you can think of like Breath of the Wild shrines, but with Sonic levels inside, where you go to a place on the map and then there's just basically like I'd say like 2-minute Sonic the Hedgehog 3D level kind of thing, or sometimes it's 2D as well, and you can just kind of go through there as well. And then you also get currency from those, which are like vault keys and things like that. Well, there's other places to get vault keys as well, but those are kind of the main places to get vault keys, and those vault keys open up chaos emeralds, and then you use those chaos emeralds to go fight the boss. So it's like this kind of upward chain that happens of just like resources for relationship cutscenes, resources for cyberspace zones, which give you resources for emeralds, and then the emeralds give you the ability to go fight the boss and move on to the next area kind of thing. There's also items around the world for like optional upgrades for Sonic, so you can increase his attack power, defense, speed, also like the number of rings you can hold, but you start out with like 400 rings on normal mode, so like there's most of the time I think it's plenty of rings, and you can also like spawn your own rings through like this special move that I completely forgot was even a part of this game, because I think it's kind of whatever. It's like a little trail you can kind of put behind yourself. It's like one of Sonic's more distinct moves in this game, but honestly I feel like the implementation's kind of whatever. It didn't really jump out to me like an exciting part of the game. It's just kind of like the, oh, I need to do something with this one mechanic all of a sudden that I forgot I had kind of thing. So it's a really simple loop overall with the kind of resource collecting, but I think it really works, and I think it's something that especially if you just are going to explore the world initially, you kind of naturally do already. So like I just would kind of like go around the outer edge of this the open world and things like that, and just kind of like explore and go up and down and just, you know, kind of get the full sense of the world. And during that time I pretty much would collect all the resources I need, as long as I'm interacting with the obstacles, fighting the bosses, you know, doing the like random little puzzles around the world and things like that. However, I did find that like really late in the game there definitely seemed to be a heavier grind, and maybe this is like my own like disinterest kind of coming at the end, where I feel like the first 3 worlds themselves feel really good to play through, but there's like a 4th world at the end that just feels like really extra and not really necessary. So I think it like overstayed its welcome a little bit, but you know, it basically would go through and do that resource loop about 4 times throughout the whole game itself. So I really enjoyed the cyberspace zones in this game, though. This is the place where you get like the vault keys. And I think it kind of did something that I've never really done with Sonic games before, and that's really actually grind out for rank. So, you know, if you ever played a Sonic game before, you go through the course, and at the end you get a ranking that's like C, B, D, or D, A, S, whatever, right? And usually the reward is like a emblem or something like that. I always forget what the emblems are for. They're for stuff, I don't remember what they're for. They're probably important, but like most of the time it's not important enough for you to just finish the story, so I'm just like, whatever. But the fact that this like feeds into the you know, the vault keys that let you get the emeralds in this case, and due to the short length of them as well, made me really want to grind them. So I had a lot of fun times, like really trying to get as many rings as possible, finish the levels as quickly as possible, find all the red rings in the level and things like that. And so it was really kind of fun grinding those level out to some extent, and like really trying to get the best time on it in a way that I usually don't really bother with in a Sonic game, because I feel like the rewards for doing so don't really play into like the core game itself. It's more about the extra content at the end, if you're really gonna like try to grind out and get as much out of that game as you possibly can. But I will say that the cyberspace zones, they are very bland in some ways. They feel like modern 3D Sonic levels, and they feel good to play, I think, but they're just not that interesting overall. So I feel like the grind itself is like fun enough to get through for those, but I wouldn't go out of my way to play every cyberspace zone. And because of how that grind works, where you can basically get like, I think it's like 7 vault keys from each one if you get all the objectives in it, like you don't need to do all of them. And I only would do maybe like 3 or 4 an entire zone, and that was kind of about it. I think there's like 8 to 9 in total maybe, and like at some point they reuse assets, and the level design doesn't really change all that much, so I kind of just would lose interest to some extent. Not really lose interest, it wasn't important for me to go and find every one of those cyberspace zones, because they just didn't feel special enough. But again, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it was something that worked really well, and that if you don't have to go find every single one, I think it's preferable in that way, personally, for me. I will say the overworld itself is pretty basic. I don't really mind it so much in this game. Like basically when you're going around the world, it's basically just kind of like rocky mountains, and that's kind of it. All the obstacles in the world feel a little different, but more or less it's either a mountain, or there's not a mountain, or there's a hole that you're gonna fall into. One of those 3 things are gonna be what you're interacting with in the world, and then so everything else in between is kind of more about just like the environments. There are like in the desert level in particular, there's like some pretty cool areas, like an underground ruins thing, and some like canyons that you kind of go through that feel more like traditional Sonic levels in the open world to some extent. But it is most the areas largely feel the same. I don't really mind it so much in this game because it is kind of the first attempt at something like this, and I think the novelty of Sonic himself just moving around the world is good enough. But I think for future games especially, I think that it's something that it would be good to have more diversity in the area design. I think the thing that I was really kind of blown away by with this game, though, is that this feels like an open world game that retains all the values of what I view as important for a Sonic game, and it does it in an open world sense. And like when you're playing that game, even though it's open world, it feels like a Sonic game still. Which I think is something that I really can't say about another game, the game that everyone compares this game to. I did this myself during this whole segment, is I think this game does a better job than like Breath of the Wild in terms of representing the series it's from. I think if you've heard me talk about before, I'm not a huge Breath of the Wild fan for a lot of reasons. I think Breath of the Wild does a lot of things really, really good, and a lot of things not so great. And a lot of those things that it does not so great are what I think are kind of the tent poles of the Zelda series with the dungeon design, right? Reward structure, puzzles, how big of an impact that like getting different weapons and stuff has, and things like that. All that's really kind of missing, or at least is not as well implemented as previous Zelda games in Breath of the Wild. For me, at least, somebody who was like a fan of Zelda, I kind of felt like that game didn't do what I wanted to do. And Sonic Frontiers feels like a game that kind of delivers on almost every aspect that I wanted. And the things that I didn't care about for like the combat and things like that, I think are things that are not important enough for me to care that much about personally. So I think it's a really solid game, though. Again, if you've been looking to see where the Sonic series goes next, I think Sonic Frontiers is definitely like a must play for you.